Roman Trier depended on food production from its rural hinterland to feed its fast-growing population. And at the center of this economy stood the Villa Rustica. Hundreds of Gallo-Roman estates were the engines of this agricultural economy. And today we will visit a couple of them, one in Bollendorf and another in Mering, both in the vicinity of Trier. And we will also try to get a better understanding of the agricultural economy that they championed. My name is Christian, and this is episode 6 of Romans on the Moselle. There was a continuity in agriculture from the late Iron Age into the Roman era. The Celtic landowners, they were no strangers to settled farming, and the arrival of the Romans brought more of an evolution than a revolution. For sure, they did expand the market for agricultural products, and they did introduce some new technologies that helped improve the productivity of agriculture. And this made the Celtic landowners wealthier, and they began transforming their traditional farmsteads into increasingly elaborate Gallo-Roman country villas.
For those of you who would like to dig a bit deeper into this subject, I found these 3 books very useful. They are all excellent, with a slightly different focus, so they complement each other nicely. More details can be found on our website. As a starting point, the Celtic farmsteads that preceded the arrival of the Romans were in the northeast of Gaul primarily rectangular houses held up by wooden posts, typically with meshed clay-filled walls. We've seen these houses before at the Titelberg Oppidum. Practical, homogeneous, and relatively easy to build, they tended to consist of just one big room with a hearth in the center. This large space was used both as living quarters and for crafts, while in winter sometimes even housing animals and humans together under the same roof. This helped keep everyone warm in the cold northern Gallic winter. The Celts did not display their wealth and social standing by investing in luxurious houses. That they did in other ways. The arrival of the Romans did not completely sweep away with these Celtic-style farmsteads. They continued to coexist with Roman villas for a long time, especially as lodgings for tenant farmers.
The Roman army was the first to boost demand for agricultural products, followed then by the growth of Trier. And the Romans introduced money, peace, better roads, all of which helped the agricultural market to develop. And the Treveri landowners, they made the most of this. They invested in more land, hired more workers, invested in new tools, crops, more animals. And of course, their growing incomes were invested in ever more elaborate Gallo-Roman country villas, now with solid stone foundations, columned porticos, and even glass windows.
These villas came in different shapes and sizes, and they tended to become more elaborate over time. To keep a sense of this evolution, we will start with a visit to one of the more modest ones. The Villa Bollendorf, located in today's Germany, just to the east of Luxembourg. It's a good example of a smaller Gallo-Roman Villa Rustica. It was built sometime towards the end of the 1st century CE, extended to this final look in the 3rd century before it ultimately succumbed to the Frankish invasions of the 5th century. It is placed on a hillside overlooking the river Sauer, a tributary of the Moselle. A road connected it to the river, which was navigable in Roman times, which provided the means for transporting agricultural products to the market. In Roman times, this was just one of many agricultural estates in the fertile Sauer Valley region. This rather compact-looking building complex is of a design that was quite common in the Roman north, but much less so around the Mediterranean. The colder climate made this design more practical, with a focus on indoor space rather than shaded courtyards. It consists of one larger central building with two projecting corner towers on each side, with a covered veranda and staircase in front. It was discovered in 1895 and was thus one of the first villas in the region to be thoroughly excavated. The protective structure that we see here was erected in 1997, and this allowed for a partial reconstruction of some of the interiors. Not to forget, the villa's living room offers perfect shelter for the occasional game of boule, especially on a rainy day. Let's turn to the villa's interior, based on the surviving stone foundations. The large central hall is the main living room of the villa, around 180 square meters in size, with a hearth in the top left corner, used for heating and cooking. Historians believe that this hall started off as a shared living and working area along the lines of traditional Celtic houses. It initially had a wide enough gate on the left side to allow wagons to enter. Next door there was a small separate room of unknown use, but was certainly large enough to serve as a bedroom or perhaps storage. At a slightly later date, this elongated room was added to the back of the house. This too had a large opening at the far end, suggesting that it had become a dedicated utility room and work area, accessible from the outside. This would allow the main hall to morph into a dedicated Roman-style living and reception hall. The two front towers had fantastic views to the south overlooking the river valley. The foundations are so thick that they likely had upper floors as well. These rooms would have been very suitable as family bedrooms. On the left side of the house, the former wide entrance to the main hall was succeeded by a bath facility along traditional Roman lines. Based on coins found here, the bath has been dated to the end of the 3rd century. The point of entry for bathers would be a small room for undressing. This would lead into the cold room, the frigidarium, which had a cold water pool to the left. After this, you would step in to relax for a while in the comfortably warm tepidarium. It contained no pool, but allowed for a gradual warming up of the bathers before entering the final stage of the bathing ritual. They would then step into the caldarium, the hot room with a hot bath. The baths were heated with hot air that was led through an underfloor brick-lined hypocaust system from a wood-fired furnace located in the main hall. One additional room benefited from the comforts of the underfloor heating system, but was not actually part of the baths, a warmed-up living space that offered a bit of extra comfort during cold winter days. The main entrance to the villa was an external staircase that led up to the front portico. Together with the corner towers, this made for an impressive front view of the villa from the valley below. The villa's cellar was located underneath the portico, with an internal staircase leading down to it from within the main hall.
The evolution of this villa from a Celtic style great shared hall into a much clearer separation between living and working areas point to the growing prosperity of this family and also to its gradual process of Romanization. And this suggests that this was a Treveri land-owning family owning it, and not Roman settlements of Mediterranean origin. And indeed, this is believed to be the case with the vast majority of country villas in the Moselle region, which was never really targeted for Roman colonial settlement on any great scale.
The villa at Bollendorf has not been rebuilt, as you can see, but a few others have been, at least partially. This is the case with our second example, the Grand Villa Rustica at Mering. The Mering villa was notably bigger than that in Bollendorf, with a total of 34 rooms in total at its peak in the early 4th century. But it still conformed to the same Gallo-Roman style as that in Bollendorf, with its characteristic front portico entrance flanked by projecting corner towers. The reconstruction is true to the original, but only partial. It thus focuses on the front section of the original smaller version. It includes the central portico and the 2 initial corner towers, but leaves out both the later extensions and much of the main building behind. Still, since the stone foundations are visible for the entire villa, we can still walk through all the rooms. The villa was built in the early 2nd century CE, on the southern banks of the Moselle, just to the east of Trier. The location was presumably chosen both because of its proximity to a major Roman road and for its beautiful view of the river. It was expanded in several stages, again mirroring the owner's growing prosperity. The original version is shown here in black, the later additions in purple. The villa survived until it was finally destroyed by Germanic invaders in the middle of the 4th century. It was rediscovered in the early 19th century and thoroughly excavated in the 1980s. So let's have a look at its floor plan. Starting with its original setup, this is actually quite similar to that in Bollendorf, both in its floor plan and its overall size. It was dominated by a large living and workspace in the center. Here there was also a kitchen with a hearth, keeping it warm in winter. Steps led down to a cellar located underneath one of the corner towers. This might have been useful for food cold storage. Adjacent to the living room were 2 bedrooms, either for family members or for servants, which would have been convenient in light of their proximity to the kitchen and the need to keep the heating going at night. Dominating the front view of the villa was a portico, the villa's main entrance. On each side were the 2 projecting corner towers, which presumably would serve as living quarters. In the back there were utility rooms and heating. If we then turn to the various extensions, rooms 6 and 7 indicate the changing room and then hot and cold baths that were installed towards the end of the 2nd century. In the 3rd century, the villa was extended on the left side with 3 new living rooms. The middle one was heated in winter with underfloor heating thanks to the new adjacent furnace. Covering the heated floor, remnants of a beautiful floor mosaic has been found. And finally, 2 new front wings were installed, containing 7 more rooms for living and sleeping. In its most expanded form, this was thus quite a luxurious villa, able to comfortably house not just the family, but also visiting guests and domestic servants. The villa at Bollendorf was in total around 400 square meters. The one in Mering ended up being 3 times as large. This was the manor house of a prosperous estate. Luxurious installations such as floor heating, baths, and mosaic floors served to emphasize the owner's standing as part of the landowning elite. They would quite likely also have a house in Trier and be part of the city council that governed the Treveri estate on Rome's behalf. In the Roman world, there was an almost complete overlap between economic and political power. And economic power drew on land ownership. Let's not forget that the Roman economy was dominated by agriculture, and those who were wealthy were so primarily as a result of being successful landowners. I could not resist mentioning one more villa in this program, because it is a very special case. Although no villas have survived intact since Roman times, there is one partial survivor. In the small village of Boos, just to the south of Koblenz, the local church was built on the foundations of a 2nd century Villa Rustica. As a result, a large portion of its cellar has been preserved. As you can see, we're able to visit these rooms today, open to the public. These vaulted cellar rooms were cooler, also in summer, and were therefore essential for food storage.
While the main manor houses have often been the most extensively excavated and sometimes only excavated parts of these estates by archaeologists, there was much more to them.
The different components of a Villa Rustica can be illustrated by the archaeological findings at that in Bonndorf, just south of Stuttgart. Within a walled area, in addition to the manor house and its obligatory vegetable garden, there are also several outbuildings used for storing and treating food, tool sheds, carriage houses, and shelter for animals and farmhands. The villa's outer wall would be quite useless as defense against looting Germanic invaders, and was more likely aimed at keeping wild animals out. You would not want your free roaming chickens to be taken by the sly fox. Beyond these walls, then, lie the villa's agricultural and forested lands. A Villa Rustica, like that at Mering, would require agricultural land large enough, often hundreds of hectares, to provide the Treveri landowner with a financial surplus to both pay the taxes due to the Romans and to erect such a fancy house. Except for the very smallest ones, these were not family farms. Cultivating this land would require large numbers of agricultural workers, either as direct employees or tenant farmers. They would cultivate small pieces of land for their own sustenance, while handing over some portion, perhaps 1/3, of their output as rent to the landowner. The very existence of hundreds of such impressive villas across the Moselle region suggests quite concentrated land ownership, mirrored by a large rural underclass. Slaves, on the other hand, were much less common in northern Gaul than in Italy, where they were typically drawn from conquered peoples. To the extent that there were occasionally slaves, they might be more closely connected to the landowner's own villa. The Moselle region did not, to any great extent, have a predominantly slave-operated agricultural economy. The peculiar and extremely hierarchical villa-centered mode of organizing agriculture of the Gallo-Romans was possible only due to the structured and peaceful environment that the Romans had imposed. Villages that lumped together many small farmsteads for their own protection, well, that would only emerge in the Middle Ages after this Roman order had broken down.
As I mentioned earlier, the Romans brought an evolution, rather than a revolution, to the way the Treveri and other Gallic tribes organized themselves. The Romans were happy to let the existing Celtic Treveri landowners continue running the civitates on Rome's behalf.
Two wealth-enhancing changes brought on by Roman rule are worth stressing. The first was the creation of a large cash market for agricultural products. The second was to introduce some new technologies. Starting with the creation of a cash market, the first trigger for this was the arrival of the Roman army, which needed to be fed, housed, and clothed. A bit later on, the growth of urban centers like Trier had a similar stimulating effect. This boosted the demand for food products, leather, wool, tools, and metals. The Romans paid for this in cash, and monetizing the economy served as a grease for it to function better and allowed for more specialized crafts.
The Romans began taxing the Treveri landowners, usually on the basis of the size of their land holdings. So they had to make a surplus to pay for these taxes. Now, we shouldn't exaggerate this tax burden either. Perhaps it was in the size of 10% or so of their production, but we don't know for sure. But we do know that the landowners had enough left after paying these taxes to invest in their ever more impressive country villas with their exquisite decorations and mosaics, etc. And on top of that, they were expected to privately finance much of the public investment in cities such as Trier. To make their estates more productive, the Treviri landowners adapted to more intensive land use. They adopted higher yielding crop varieties, new fruits, new vegetables, and they adopted innovative technologies and new techniques. They hired more people to work the land, and specialized craftsmen with skills to treat food and raw materials such as wool and leather, and to manufacture and maintain farming equipment. So let's take a closer look at some of the specifics of the agricultural world of the northern Gallo-Roman Villa Rustica. Much of this has been uncovered, of course, through archaeology, but also some Roman writings, mosaics, and some very illuminating grave monuments found in the region. It is fascinating how eminently recognizable this world is. The basics of agriculture didn't really change that much until well into the modern era.
Starting with foodstuffs produced. This included grain such as wheat for bread and barley for porridge and beer, vegetables and oils pressed from poppy seeds, fruits, dairy products and meat. Not, mind you, maize, sugar and potatoes, all of which arrived in Europe only much later. As sweetener and fruit preservative, honey was popular, and beeswax was used for erasable writing tablets and for casting bronze figures. For starchy vegetables, turnips, beets and radishes were grown. Beans, peas and lentils were rich in protein. As insurance against pests and bad weather, which risked destroying entire crops, the Gallo-Romans made sure to cultivate a variety of grains, fruits and vegetables with different seasonality, environmental needs and ripening times. This also increased the output of the estate across the seasons. In addition to food, raw materials were produced for clothing, including leather, generating welcome income when sold in the market. Since cotton had not been introduced to Europe yet, wool from sheep dominated for clothing, and flax was used to produce precious linen. Wood was of course an important raw material used for heating, construction and for manufacturing most of the tools. Horses and bulls were used as beasts of burden, pulling wagons, carts and plows, and horses also for riding. Treviri horses were renowned and could be bred and exported at a profit. Oxen and horses would not typically be used primarily for meat, except at the end of their productive working lives. Raising cattle was extremely costly, since they needed large meadows for grazing and hay as winter fodder. Sheep, and even more so goats, had the great advantage of being easier to look after and cheaper to feed. Goats could be put out to pasture in hilly scrub terrain that was of little use for anything else, while providing both meat and milk. And the demand was tremendous. The Roman army used goat skin to make tents. It is estimated that around 60,000 goats were needed to tent one legion. Bells have been uncovered used by cattle, goats and sheep when grazing pastures far from settlements. Chickens were easy to breed and produced eggs, meat and feathers. Pigs were bred exclusively for food and were slaughtered in late autumn. Since they would eat almost anything, they also served as the farm's waste recyclers. Gaul was famous for its salted and smoked pork, bacon, ham and sausages, which was also a good way to preserve meat for the long winter months.
Fallow farming was put to effective use in Roman times. Land productivity could be increased by not sowing grain in every field in every year. And the fallow fields, well, they could be used by sheep and goats for grazing and at the same time fertilizing them. There's a complementarity between animal husbandry and farming. Of course, you need the animals to pull the plow and the cart to deliver the produce to the market. And manure was used to fertilize the fields and the gardens. Livestock farming was particularly attractive in areas that were difficult to farm, and this included the mountainous regions north of the Moselle.
Availability of water was of course important both for the villa residents themselves and for animal husbandry and gardening. Wells and sophisticated pumps were essential for the farm to function. Some wooden tools and wagons were manufactured and repaired by the villa's own craftsmen. Wooden tools included spades, hoes, rakes and plows, the latter preferably with an iron tip, which allowed it to go deeper and faster in the soil. The fields should be plowed and aerated at least 3 times per year. Preparing the fields for sowing was the most labor-intensive activity on the farm. Plows could be pulled by an ox. The Romans kept developing plows for greater performance, and several have been portrayed on mosaics and reliefs also in northern Gaul. One important development was the transition to wheeled plows, which transferred more pulling power to the plow and also allowed for more uniform furrows. Several important changes were introduced in the harvesting of hay. The use of dried hay to feed cattle and horses in winter was not new, but it intensified in Roman times. For the harvesting, traditionally the handheld sickle was applied, but this was time-consuming. Also two-handed scythes are believed to have been invented already by the Celts. They were common and evolved over time. Early models did not allow for cutting the grass close to the ground. This was facilitated by new scythe models emerging in the 3rd century, where the handles were placed perpendicular to the blade, just like modern ones. A major Gallo-Roman invention was the animal-pulled wheeled harvesting machine, called a vallus. It had sharpened teeth in the front that tore off the ears of grain that then fell into a collection box. These machines have been described in Roman writings and portrayed on reliefs found in both Trier and Arlon. These surviving records have been used to reproduce operational replicas, proving that they really could do the job as described. The presence of harvesting machines is indicative of fairly large estates, since the investment would not be worthwhile for smaller farms. Once the harvest was in, the grain needed to be dried and ground. Ripe grains are too coarse to eat directly. In the first instance, grinding grain produces coarse grits, which for a long time were used directly for cooking by Greeks and Romans as a kind of porridge, often mixed with salted pork, olive oil and herbs. To make bread, the Romans had to take the grinding one step further, making flour by repeated grinding, winnowing, and finally milling. Indeed, millstones have existed since the Stone Age. Even rotary mills existed in Gaul before the Roman conquest. A small hand-operated rotary mill was enough to serve the needs of a single household. Such milling would normally be the task of the women of the household. As agricultural estates grew, larger millstones were needed to produce surplus grain for selling in the market. These would either be pulled by several men or by donkeys and horses. There is a famous Roman poem where a racehorse with many victories behind him laments being retired to turning the mill in his old age. Also water mills were used, but to be efficient they required the application of innovative gears to transform the slow vertical movement of the water wheel to a faster spinning horizontal grindstone. Such a gear wheel was discovered in the well of a Roman fort in Germany. The Roman poet Ausonius, who stayed at the imperial court in Trier in the 4th century, mentioned in his poem The Mosella water wheels on the river Ruver that powered not only grain mills but also sawmills for cutting marble. Finally, wagons, whether drawn by oxen or horses, are needed to bring in the harvest and to sell the agricultural produce on the market, whether in the city or in one of the many smaller roadside settlements known as viki. A range of marketable products could be sold, including perishables such as vegetables, fruit, dairy products, and eggs, but also leather, wool, and smoked meat. Once in town, the farmer or his trusted servants would have the opportunity to purchase tools, clothing, ceramics, and the like, along with imported food products such as wine and garum, a spicy fish sauce. Wagons were highly sought after and were important for the farm's productivity. Their high status value is suggested by how common they are on funerary monuments, especially in the Moselle region. In fact, the Gauls were specialists in wagon construction, with a long tradition dating back to the early Iron Age. The most important type of wagon had 2 axles and 4 wheels, like that of the textile-producing family on the funerary column in Eagle, just to the west of Trier. Another good example is portrayed in a mosaic from Orb, Switzerland, where a wagon is being loaded with winter provisions stored in a large net. When harvesting delicate crops, a 2-wheeled variety could also be used in the fields. It had the advantage of being more versatile on uneven ground.
Now, given that we're talking about the Moselle region, you might expect me to also discuss wine growing. But the fact is that viticulture was only introduced to the region in the 3rd century, so it did come a bit later. And it's such an important subject, I think it deserves its own episode. Anyway, over time, many large Treveri landowners became increasingly wealthy and invested in ever more splendid country villas. As we will discover in the next episode, this was not just frivolous excess. It was essential for them to show that they really belonged among the ruling elites by displaying their wealth and influence in this form. And so they would wine and dine and host their influential guests in comfortable splendor and entertain them in elaborate private bathing facilities. From now on, this was how the Treveri elites would conduct their business relations and nurture their political influence.